The European Parliament is a useless political theater. And it's just not me saying it. Much more importantly, people from the heart of Europe think so themselves. Take a look at this recent Eurobarometer survey. A little warning though, the results may seem a little schizophrenic at first. Take Czechia as an example. 77% of the Czech population agree that the current international context with wars and authoritarian leaders all over the place makes voting more important than ever before. But in the June European Parliament election, only 36% of all eligible voters bothered to turn out and actually cast a vote. That perfectly confirms the survey results, where a full 62% of the population declares that they were not even interested in the European Parliament election at all. And to top it all off, 52% believe that the European Parliament as an institution should play a less important role in the future. So, we have a paradox. On the one hand, people agree that voting is now more important, at least in theory, but on the other, they also don't care at the same time. So why not ditch the European Parliament altogether? Besides, it's not just Czechs who display trends like these. If the main role of a political institution is to serve the citizens, and if those citizens do not see the institution as delivering, I think that abolishing it, in its current form at least, is the only sensible course of action. Let's talk about this more. But first, I'm Jan with Prague Pulse, and you know the drill. If you like our content, smash that like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, thanks so much to everyone supporting us on herohero.co/PraguePulse. You're really making all of this possible. Thanks so much, and now let's dive in. Now, on the surface at least, the European Parliament does seem legitimate and does remind you of your usual parliament. It has hundreds of directly elected deputies, dozens of committees and subcommittees, not one but two chambers, one in Brussels and the other one in Strasbourg. Don't ask me why it needs two places to meet though. It's even had its fair share of corruption scandals, as your usual parliament would have. In 2022, for example, hundreds of thousands in cash were seized by Belgian police and high-ranking European Parliament officials arrested, including the EP Vice President Eva Kaili. They were apparently accepting bribes from Qatar in exchange for influencing human rights legislation that would have been naturally critical toward the Gulf state. And of course, corruption is not great, but it at least makes you think that it really is business as usual in the EP. Besides, show me a parliament in Europe that has not had a corruption scandal like this one. But besides having the features of a normal parliament on the surface and even having one extra venue it objectively does not need at all, the European Parliament is and will remain a joke, a charade, and the reason is very simple. The EP still does not possess the one power that truly makes or breaks a real legislature, and that is the power to actually legislate. Now, for those of you not so well versed in EU politics, this may of course come as a surprise, but it is true. The European Parliament is not allowed to propose laws. That still remains the sole privilege and prerogative of the European Commission, the EU's quasi-government, if you will. And I strongly believe that that alone explains the somewhat schizophrenic data that I showed you at the start. You know, people may well be interested in voting in theory and in principle, and it's perfect that the EP has had direct elections since 1979, don't get me wrong. It is perfect. It remains the only EU body that has direct elections, that is. But what people really want are real elections. And by that I mean elections that can actually make a difference. And expecting people to be genuinely interested in elections to a legislative body which has not allowed to legislate is just laughable. And of course, defenders of the parliament will claim that it can just ask the Commission to issue legislation. And so the claim is that the EP can at least legislate indirectly. You know, but the funny thing here is, of course, that such a plea by the Parliament, because it is a plea the Parliament is asking the Commission, is not binding. by definition. And there's nothing easier for the Commission than just ignoring it flat out. The Commission has to at least respond to the request, of course, and it has to explain why it decides to ignore the call if it happens. So I guess that it at least is a small win for the Parliament, sure. But that's basically it. Then there's a second thing that defenders of the European Parliament will most certainly dangle in front of you. They will tell you that the EP can at least offer amendments to laws proposed by the Commission in the first place. And they can talk out potential disagreements in the so-called trialogue, which is a political process and not a sex practice that you would see in a Belgian nightclub. And in the trialogue, of course, all three major institutions of the EU, that is the Commission, the Parliament and the Council, are represented. Again, that is cool that the Parliament has this option, and probably it's better than nothing, but it is hardly true legislative power. Because in the whole process, the EP is always purely dependent on the Commission, which proposes the laws, and then the Parliament is just allowed to pass amendments to legislation that has been initiated by the Commission. Plus, again, the whole system is so enormously complicated that many people, and rightly so, just choose to ignore it altogether. And honestly, given how complicated the system really is, it is no wonder that so many people would like to see the EP diminish in importance or disappear altogether. Because it is the only directly elected institution in the EU, the main function of the European Parliament in its current form is to at least give off the appearance of a vibrant democracy in action. And rest assured, there is plenty of action in the plenary of the EP. In April, for example, now former Slovak MEP Miroslav Radačovský released a real dove, that is a living bird, in the plenary, to demonstrate that he really wants peace in Ukraine. Who doesn't, right? In 2022, a Bulgarian MEP performed a Nazi salute right in the chamber. And obviously, those are just two examples of many. And the new EP, elected in June, is also set to bring us enough entertainment, of course. Check out our recent video on the 10 craziest newly elected MEPs. Now, I have a feeling that those may be a fun bunch as well. Arguably, the most important power of the EP as it is now comes at the beginning of each parliamentary term, and that is to choose a new commission president and a new college of commissioners. Broadly speaking, that means confirming a new European quasi-government. But even then, it only confirms the nominees presented by EU member states. Yes, it can reject them, but it cannot stand its own candidates for government in exchange, like most other legislatures in the world would be able to. The proposed candidates don't even have to run for a European Parliament seat themselves. They just need to be supported by enough people in the European Parliament factions, which are composed of national political parties. Take an example. Ursula von der Leyen, now elected for a second term as Commission President, has never had a seat in the EP herself, and yet she will now hold the most important job for a second time. So in the end, while people do vote in EP elections directly, they don't really have any real power to decide who really runs the show in the end. And that, quite naturally, can lead to frustration. Who wouldn't be frustrated? By the way, the direct election to the European Parliament also has its own fair share of problems. Mainly, if you quite logically expect truly European political parties to run in European Parliament elections, you are wrong. In fact, there are no real European political parties at all. While they do nominally exist on paper, there are nothing more than tentative groupings of national political parties. It is national political parties and national political parties only that select, finance, and promote candidates for EP elections. And people in their EU member state can only vote for their own domestic candidates. So that means, for example, that there is no way for a Czech voter to vote for a Polish, German, or French EP candidates. Now, what this leads to, quite logically, is that those campaigns are then quite often run on purely national issues, that the EP has nothing to do with whatsoever. For example, we've seen discussions in the run-up to the election on how big pensions are supposed to be, whether or not a given country should accept the euro as currency, or how the education systems should be reformed in the given country. And none of those things can really be decided in the EP. But people still vote for those candidates based on their views on such topics. Now, do you really blame the voters, though? They see that the same party names appear on their EP ballots, often the same candidate faces, the same candidate names, who are talking about the same topics over and over again, and we cannot really expect the average voter to understand how the EU actually works, given how complicated it is. Heck, the candidates themselves often have no clue whatsoever, but they still run for EP elections. There are whole university courses dedicated only to understanding EU politics, so we cannot expect the average voter to understand it on his or her own. So what we see today is a quasi-legislature, but with no legislative power. So it's not really a legislature. Plus, an institution that costs enormous amounts of money to run. Take this. Each of its 720 members earns somewhere around 120,000 euros a year. Each of those 720 members, which is around triple of the average salary in the EU, by the way. Not to mention the enormous costs to keep the apparatus running. A small example. As mentioned before, each month the EP with the entire apparatus moves from Brussels to Strasbourg, where it holds one plenary session, and then it moves back to Brussels with the whole thing. This takes many trucks, planes and cars to transport all the necessary stuff, together with all the MEPs. Now, the entire operation costs more than 100 million euros each year, huge CO2 emissions, and about 100 full-time staff that are required to maintain the building in Strasbourg all the time. The building is even open to the public all the time, even when it is completely empty of politicians. And that essentially, of course, takes a lot of money. It is an open secret that France is the main reason this is still going on. Essentially, to get rid of the EP seat in Strasbourg, the founding treaties of the EU would need to be changed. And for that, France would have to agree as well. And that is pretty much impossible, given the prestige and perceived economic benefit that France claims that this brings to Strasbourg. But the stated CO2 reduction goals and savings measures are quite laughable again when we consider how much is wasted on such a move on a seat that is not needed at all, and which is at the very least very much non-essential. And the image of the EP is damaged yet again, even if we don't think about the wasted money and resources and the environment. So, essentially, my argument is that EU leaders should be willing to overcome their pride and give the European Parliament true legislative power, which it doesn't have right now, while getting rid of useless customs, such as traveling back and forth between Brussels and Strasbourg, and getting rid of difficult-to-understand rules, even if that all means opening up difficult treaty revisions. If they are not willing to bite the bullet, the EP in its current form is nothing more than a talking shop, a charade, and can quite easily be abolished altogether. Now, don't get me wrong, I myself am a supporter of the EU, and I strongly believe that some sort of a European Parliament is necessary, especially in today's world. Challenges to our safety and prosperity are becoming more and more complex and international in nature. It is enormously naive to think that nationalist, inward-thinking solutions are the cure. They're not. Quite the contrary, we need to cooperate with like-minded partners and unite in larger bodies, take common decisions, and pool resources. So for that, I truly, genuinely believe that the EU is a great tool. A lot has been done in this respect since the EU was established, I know. I know that the EP has been trying to maximize its leverage recently, even within the limited confines of the current treaties. I know all of that. It has become bolder to challenge other EU institutions and bring them to account. For example, when it first insisted that the Commission tie EU money to respect of human rights in member states and then sue to the Commission when it decided anyway to release money to Hungary, which is not democratic anymore. So things may be moving in the right direction, but not fast enough. And voters are not stupid. They see that the real power still lies with national parliaments, and so it is no wonder that turnout has been so low in EP elections. We also cannot credibly criticize the media for not covering Brussels and the EP enough when it was the decision of our lawmakers, of our national leaders, to essentially turn EP elections into a space where voters can only voice disaffection with national politics. That has nothing to do with the European Parliament. But that still happens. So the media will naturally pay less attention to the European Parliament because it is simply not that relevant. What we do need is true legislative power and transnational lists for the European Parliament. We need truly functional European political parties. That would easily force EU citizens to pay more attention to the EP, because the center of power would then shift there, and they would finally have a chance to directly influence the angle of that shift through the direct election. And if EU national leaders are not willing to grant this to us, if they are not brave enough to reopen the treaties, it may be better not to have any European Parliament at all, rather than having a dysfunctional one. The world is simply moving too fast for us to be able to afford expensive experiments where national parties can only park incapable domestic politicians so that they don't stand in the way of the real, more important domestic politics. Now, what do you think about the role of the European Parliament today? Do leave a comment down below, and if you liked my take, do subscribe and like this video, it helps us a lot. Also, if you want to become a true legend for me and for ProgPulse, please consider supporting us on herohero.co/ProgPulse. Thank you so much. This has been Jan with ProgPulse, and have a great one, as always.